As you probably know, we've just seized a tanker on the coast of Venezuela.
December 10th, 2025, 6 a.m. The oil tanker Skipper was 12 nautical miles off Venezuela's coast when the radio crackled. For years, vessels like this had been moving Venezuelan crude past U.S. sanctions using shadow networks and spoofed transponders. The crew thought they knew the game. At 6:47 a.m., military helicopters appeared overhead. In this video, we'll find out why this single tanker seizure triggered the most provocative U.S. boarding operation in the Caribbean in over 2 decades, and what it reveals about the real strategy behind 15,000 American troops in the region. The Skipper wasn't just another sanctions-dodging tanker. At 332 meters long, this very large crude carrier could transport 2 million barrels of oil. On December 10th, its holds carried 1.8 million barrels worth $90 million. That's enough to power a city of 500,000 people for 3 months. But this vessel had something that made it different. 3 names, 3 flags, and connections to 3 designated terrorist organizations. When it was called the Odessa back in 2022, U.S. Treasury sanctioned it for facilitating oil trades on behalf of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard and Hezbollah. The network ran through a Switzerland-based Ukrainian trader who used shell companies in the Marshall Islands and Liberia to hide ownership. Every time authorities got close, the vessel would change its name, re-register under a new flag, and disappear back into what maritime analysts call the dark fleet. Hundreds of these vessels exist. Rusting tankers with falsified documents, spoofed location transponders, and crews who know exactly how far they can push before anyone with real enforcement authority decides to act. For 4 years, the answer had been pretty far. Venezuela produces roughly 1 million barrels of oil per day. At current prices, that's $80 million in daily revenue. 90% of Venezuela's export earnings come from oil. Every tanker that successfully delivers that crude to market is another month Maduro stays in power. The Skipper represented more than cargo. It represented a system that had been working. But in November 2025, something fundamental shifted. The USS Gerald Ford, the world's largest and most advanced aircraft carrier, arrived in the Caribbean with its strike group. 15,000 American military personnel deployed across Puerto Rico, and U.S. Southern Command began mapping what intelligence sources called the nexus, the connections between specific vessels, specific regime officials, and specific financial networks keeping Maduro's government alive. The Skipper was on that map. On December 4th, the tanker arrived at the Jose terminal near Barcelona, Venezuela. Satellite imagery captured the entire loading operation. 14 hours of pumping crude while the vessel's transponder broadcast a location 560 miles away, claiming it was off the coast of Georgetown, Guyana. The ship was physically docked at a Venezuelan oil terminal while its digital signature said it was somewhere else entirely. This is called spoofing. It violates international maritime law, and it told U.S. intelligence exactly what they needed to know. By December 8th, federal prosecutors in the Southern District of Florida had their warrant. The document cited sanctions evasion, material support to foreign terrorist organizations, and conspiracy. It authorized seizure in international waters. On December 9th, the Skipper finished loading and began moving northwest toward Cuba. From there, the oil would move to Asian buyers through Cuban intermediaries. At least 200,000 barrels had already been transferred to another tanker near Curaçao. The crew had made this run before. They knew the route. They knew the protocols for staying in international waters where enforcement had always been theoretical. They didn't know that this time, theory was about to meet reality. At 4:30 a.m. on December 10th, military helicopters lifted off from the USS Gerald Ford. Aboard were members of the Coast Guard's Maritime Security Response Team, elite operators trained for high-risk boardings, 10 Coast Guard personnel, 10 Marines, Special Operations Forces, the kind of team you don't deploy for a routine stop. The helicopters flew low, using darkness and ocean spray to mask their approach. At 6 a.m., They were in position. That's when the call came through on Channel 16, the International Maritime Distress Frequency. Motor vessel skipper, this is United States Coast Guard. You are ordered to stop your engines and prepare to receive a boarding party. Acknowledge immediately. 11 seconds of silence. Then the captain responded. Coast Guard, we are flagged merchant vessel in international waters. We do not acknowledge your authority. Wrong answer. At 6:12 a.m., the helicopters moved in. The footage Attorney General Pam Bondi released later shows what happened next. Operators fast roping down to the tanker's deck, 40 feet per second. 8 seconds from helicopter to steel plating. Weapons raised. Moving immediately to secure the bridge, engine room, and communications. The entire boarding took 4 minutes and 17 seconds. No shots fired. The 23 crew members offered no resistance. By 6:47 a.m., American personnel had control. The engines were shut down. The crew was secured in the mess hall. An American flag went up on the foremast. The United States had just seized a civilian oil tanker in international waters. Here's what makes this different from every other maritime interdiction in Caribbean history. Normally, the Coast Guard boards vessels to search for drugs. They gather evidence, build criminal cases, follow protocols designed to hold up in federal court. This wasn't that. This was a military-style operation executed by elite forces launched from an aircraft carrier. The kind of operation you conduct when the vessel itself is the target, when you're not stopping drugs, when you're cutting off a financial artery. 6 hours later, President Trump announced the seizure at a White House cabinet meeting.
As you probably know, we've just seized a tanker on the coast of Venezuela, a large tanker, very large. Largest one ever seized, actually.
We've just seized a tanker on the coast of Venezuela. Large tanker, very large. Largest one ever seized, actually. It was seized for a very good reason. When reporters asked what would happen to the oil, Trump leaned back in his chair. We keep it, I guess. 3 words that revealed everything. The official legal justification went like this. The skipper was sanctioned in 2022 for facilitating oil trades supporting Iran's Revolutionary Guard and Hezbollah. A federal warrant authorized seizure based on material support to designated foreign terrorist organizations. The vessel was flying a Guyana flag, but wasn't registered there. Under international law, stateless vessels can be boarded and seized on the high seas. Attorney General Pam Bondi called it straightforward sanctions enforcement. Homeland Security Secretary Kristi Noem said it was directed by the president to push back on a regime flooding America with deadly drugs. But legal experts immediately spotted problems. The vessel was seized in international waters, beyond any nation's territorial jurisdiction. The terrorist organization designation relied on connecting the ship to Iranian and Lebanese groups, not to Venezuelan drug trafficking. And the timing, coming after months of military buildup and explicit threats against Maduro, made the sanctions argument look like legal cover for something else. Vincent O'Hara, a naval historian, called the seizure very unusual and provocative. Francisco Rodriguez, a Venezuelan economist, wrote that the U.S. has no jurisdiction to enforce unilateral sanctions on non-U.S. persons outside its territory. Senator Chris Van Hollen from Maryland sits on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He was more direct. This shows that their whole cover story, that this is about interdicting drugs, is a big lie. This is about regime change by force. Venezuela's foreign ministry released a statement. The true reasons for the prolonged aggression against Venezuela have finally been exposed. It is not migration. It is not drug trafficking. It is not democracy. It is not human rights. It was always about our natural resources, our oil, our energy. And then there was Trump's own statement. We keep it, I guess. That single sentence, spoken almost casually, undercut the entire legal framework. Because if this was about sanctions enforcement and stopping terrorist financing, the oil would be held as evidence or sold with proceeds going to terrorism victims, as previous cases had done. Instead, Trump suggested the U.S. would simply keep $90 million worth of Venezuelan crude, which raises an obvious question. What is this really about? To understand what's happening, you need to understand how Venezuela has survived 6 years of crushing sanctions. Since 2019, Venezuela has relied on what maritime analysts call the dark fleet. Hundreds of aging tankers with falsified documents, constantly changing names and flags, equipped with technology that lets them spoof their locations or go completely dark. These vessels move oil from Venezuela to buyers in China, India, and other countries willing to look the other way. They transfer cargo ship to ship in the middle of the ocean to hide the oil's origin. They use networks of shell companies registered in places like the Marshall Islands, Liberia, and Panama to obscure ownership. The skipper was part of this fleet. But it wasn't just moving Venezuelan oil. Maritime tracking data shows the vessel had also carried Iranian crude. It docked in Egypt, the UAE, and Hong Kong. In July 2025, it loitered less than 15 miles off Iran's coast for several days. This wasn't just about helping Venezuela evade sanctions. This was about a broader network connecting sanctioned regimes. Michelle Wiesa-Bachmann, a senior analyst at Windward Maritime Intelligence, said after the seizure, there are hundreds of flagless, stateless tankers that have been a lifeline for sanctioned oil revenues for regimes like Maduro's, Iran, and for the Kremlin. They can no longer operate unchallenged. That last part is key. They can no longer operate unchallenged. Because the seizure sent a message to every other captain on the Dark Fleet. The old rules don't apply anymore. International waters aren't safe. Spoofed transponders won't protect you. And the U.S. is willing to use military assets to enforce sanctions in ways it never has before. Within 48 hours, shipping insurance rates for Venezuelan crude spiked 47%. Several intermediary companies in Dubai and Singapore quietly announced they were reviewing their exposure to Venezuelan oil contracts. Lloyd's of London began requiring additional documentation for any vessel that had called at a Venezuelan port in the previous 18 months. The economic effect was immediate. Venezuela still has 17 tankers at sea right now, 17 crews watching the horizon, wondering if helicopters will appear. And here's what makes this particularly significant. The Dark Fleet doesn't just serve Venezuela. Russia uses similar vessels to evade sanctions on its oil. Iran has been doing this for over a decade. North Korea moves everything from oil to weapons using these methods. The skipper seizure established a precedent. If the U.S. can board and seize a tanker in international waters based on sanctions violations and terrorist connections, the same legal framework applies to Russian tankers in the Black Sea, Iranian tankers in the Persian Gulf, and Chinese vessels supplying North Korea. One seizure, global implications. On December 11th, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth spoke at a summit in Fort Wayne, Indiana. A reporter asked about next steps in Venezuela. His answer was direct. We're going to start doing those strikes on land too. You know, the land is much easier. At that moment, 15,000 U.S. military personnel were positioned in Puerto Rico and across the Caribbean. The USS Gerald Ford and its strike group, 8 other warships, squadrons of F-35 stealth fighters, enough amphibious assault capability to land several thousand Marines on any coastline. The tanker seizure was a signal, but military planners have been wrestling with what comes after. Venezuela isn't Iraq, it isn't Panama. The country has a standing military of 125,000 troops, plus a militia Maduro claims numbers over 4 million. Russian-made S-300 air defense systems protect Caracas. The country is twice the size of California, with terrain ranging from coastal lowlands to dense jungle to mountainous regions, where conventional operations become extremely difficult. Even limited strikes carry enormous risks. Oil infrastructure is spread across hundreds of square kilometers. Regime targets are hardened and dispersed. Any military action that kills Venezuelan civilians likely solidifies support for Maduro rather than undermining it. Which brings us back to the skipper. The seizure revealed the actual strategy. Not invasion, economic strangulation. Make it impossible to sell oil. Cut off the money. Force Maduro's inner circle to calculate whether staying loyal is worth watching their foreign bank accounts freeze and their international business networks collapse. The skipper is currently anchored under Coast Guard custody off Puerto Rico. Its cargo, 1.8 million barrels of Venezuelan crude, sits in the vessel's holds, legally frozen by federal court order. The crew was released and sent back to their home countries. The ship itself is reportedly heading to Houston. But here's what everyone is watching now. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has been the driving force behind anti-Maduro policy. As a senator from Florida, representing many Venezuelan exiles, he pushed for regime change for years. Now, he has the authority to make it happen. Trump, meanwhile, has been characteristically blunt about his interests. The National Security Strategy document released in November made clear the administration wants to dominate the Western Hemisphere and keep outside powers like China and Russia out. Trump has also made no secret of his interest in Venezuela's vast, untapped oil and gas reserves, some of the largest in the hemisphere. On December 9th, Trump told reporters not to read anything into his statement about closing Venezuelan airspace. Then he said land strikes could begin very soon. Intelligence analysts see a pattern forming: maximum pressure through economic warfare, show of military force to signal seriousness, wait for someone in Maduro's inner circle to decide it's time for him to go. The question is whether that calculation happens before or after the U.S. decides to strike targets inside Venezuela, and whether Maduro's allies in Cuba, Russia, China, and Iran decide that letting Venezuela fall sets a precedent they can't afford. 3 days after the seizure, opposition leader Maria Corina Machado appeared in Oslo to accept the Nobel Peace Prize. She hadn't been seen in public for 11 months. The timing wasn't coincidental. She praised Trump's actions against Maduro's regime, saying the illegal oil revenues are used to repress and persecute our people, not to feed hungry children or pay teachers. But the prize ceremony and the tanker seizure happening on the same day created a moment Venezuela's government couldn't ignore. Maduro addressed a demonstration in Caracas and told supporters Venezuela was prepared to break the teeth of the North American empire if necessary. The rhetoric is escalating. The economic pressure is mounting. The military assets remain in position. Here's what the skipper seizure tells us about how conflicts unfold in 2025. This isn't about missiles and tanks and divisions crossing borders. It's about leverage points, finding the single vessel, the key transaction, the critical system that an entire economy depends on, then applying precise pressure until something breaks. For Venezuela, that leverage point is oil. For Maduro, it's the ability to keep selling that oil despite sanctions, despite international isolation, despite everything. The skipper represented the illusion that sanctions could be beaten through clever networks and shadow fleets. At 6:47 a.m. on December 10th, military helicopters shattered that illusion. What happens next depends on whether Maduro's inner circle reads the seizure as a one-time show of force or the beginning of a systematic campaign to cut off every drop of Venezuelan oil from world markets. Early signs suggest the latter. Insurance rates have priced in the risk. Buyers are looking elsewhere. The economic vice is tightening. And somewhere in the Caribbean right now, another Venezuelan tanker is running without its transponder, hoping the darkness and the vastness of the ocean will be enough. Based on what happened to the skipper, it probably won't be.